The temporary weakening of communist Bolshevik totalitarianism gave impetus to the development of moral opposition. The 60ers attempted to revive national consciousness through their works and active social activities. They fought for the preservation of the Ukrainian language and culture, contributed to the democratization of social and political life in Ukraine. They opposed Russification and national enslavement, advocated for the expansion of freedom of artistic creativity, and pushed for the renewal and democratization of society. In their activities, we see the continuation, in new forms and methods, of the noble traditions of the Ukrainian national liberation and human rights movement.
In our country, the 60ers are often perceived simply according to certain cliches: independence fighters and dissidents. However, it is worth reflecting what it was like to overcome restrictions, to not be afraid of being different, to seek the truth while living in the all-consuming darkness of Soviet propaganda. They were so diverse, making significant contributions to literature, engaging in journalism, literary criticism, legal defense, art, cinema, and theater, as well as excelling as inventors, doctors, and psychiatrists. Yet they all cared deeply about the fate of Ukraine.
One of the iconic figures of the resistance movement at that time was Stefania Shabatura, a talented artist and tapestry maker, a long-term political prisoner of Soviet concentration camps, a human rights activist, a member of the Ukrainian Helsinki group, and an active public figure. She distributed self-published books and took an active part in the work of the Lviv Creative Youth Club Prolysok, whose main activities were cultural, national, and educational, including concerts, literary evenings, and organizing nativity scenes at Christmas. Conservatory students initiated the organization of nativity plays, and these activities even received official approval until the mid-1960s. However, from the second half of the 1960s, prohibitions began, forcing these celebrations to be held underground. The authorities aimed for total control over artists, whose work exceeded the limits established by the communist regime. In 1971, a secret decree was issued, and a hunt began for dissidents, such as Vyacheslav Chornovil, Irina and Ihor Kalinets, Ivan Hel, Volodymyr Ivasyuk, and others. Among them was Stefania Shabatura.
Stefania Shabatura was arrested during the pogrom of the Ukrainian intelligentsia on January 12, 1972, on charges of conducting anti-Soviet propaganda. The main goal of the repressions in 1972 was to neutralize the intellectual elite of dissidents, crack down on the most active, and intimidate others. In January, 20 of the most prominent figures of the movement were arrested. In total, 89 dissidents, 55 of them from Western Ukraine, were arrested throughout 1972. Stefania Shabatura was sentenced to 5 years in strict regime camps and 3 years of exile.
Her life story could well be the basis of an exciting thriller. It includes her stay in Mordovia with fellow underground women Halina Didik, Darka Husiak, Katarina Zaritska, Maria Palchak, Irina Orisia Senik, dissident from Odessa Nina Strokata Karavanska, and her friend Irina Kalinets. Her meetings and correspondence with Vasyl Stus, the tragic death of her fiancé Marian Hatal, to whom she remained faithful until the end of her life, the destruction of more than 300 of her paintings by the Chekists in the concentration camp, and her struggles in Lviv after her release without a residence permit or a job. In one of her later interviews, Stefania Mikhailovna said, "I had enough work and actively started a creative path. And then I was thrown to the ground from that height. I think that this is God's will. I will not say that the KGB is to blame. The repression is obvious, but there is God's will in all of this. It was necessary. People like me were needed. We had to go our way and not leave it. We passed it with dignity. This choice was not mine, nor anyone else's, but God's.
One of the brightest representatives of the 60ers was the poet Vasyl Symonenko, a native of Poltava region and a graduate of the Faculty of Journalism at Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. He was called a poet without a stone behind his soul by literary critics. Vasyl Symonenko started writing in his student years. However, only a collection of lyrics and a fairy tale for children were published during his lifetime. He described his poetic style by saying, "There is something in me from my grandfather Taras and great-grandfather Skovoroda." His poems that were allowed to be printed were censored. Instead, Vasyl Symonenko's self-published collections, which were a satire of the Soviet system, gained great popularity.
In the spring of 1960, in Kyiv, in the cinema hall of the October Palace, the Creative Youth Club began to operate. Its members included Ivan Drach, Alla Horska, Lina Kostenko, Vasyl Stus, Mykola Vinhranovsky, Ivan Svitlichny, Ludmila Semikina, Halina Sevruk, Halina Zubchenko, Yevhen Sverstyuk, and others. Vasyl Symonenko also took part in the work of the club, traveled extensively around Ukraine, and spoke at literary creative evenings and debates. Once, during a creative meeting at the Cherkasy Pedagogical Institute, a note came to the stage. "What kind of independent Ukraine do you mean when you write, 'Let America and Russia be silent, and I have a sacred filial right to be alone with my mother'?" Vasyl calmly and as if carelessly read this note and replied, "I have only one Ukraine. If the author of the question knows another, let him say, we will choose."
On the initiative of the Creative Youth Club, the search for mass burial sites for victims of Stalinist repressions began. Vasyl Symonenko and his colleagues participated in the collection of testimonies, personally visiting the outskirts of Kyiv and looking for witnesses. It was then that the places of secret mass burials at Lukyanov and Vasylkiv cemeteries and in the Kyiv forest were discovered for the first time. A well-known incident occurred when Les Tanyuk, Alla Horska, and Vasyl Symonenko saw boys playing football in a clearing in the Bukivna forest. For the ball, they were using a skull with a hole in the back of the head. 2 more skulls marked the goal line. After that, Vasyl, together with other members of the club, drew up and sent a memorandum to the Kyiv City Council demanding that the places of mass burials be publicized and turned into national places of mourning and remembrance. The political apparatus could not forgive such audacity, and Symonenko was put under surveillance.
In the summer of 1962, Symonenko was arrested. At the railway station in Cherkasy, a banal argument broke out between a waitress and Symonenko. When the counter hostess refused to sell Vasyl cigarettes, a few minutes before the lunch break. Indignant, he protested. 2 police officers on duty asked him to show his documents. Vasyl presented an editorial certificate, but the officers unceremoniously twisted his hands and dragged him to the railway station police room in front of a crowd. The next day, colleagues searched for the poet in the detention cell of the police line department as far as the town of Smila, 30 kilometers from the regional center. Vasyl showed bruises, told how he was beaten, and complained that it was as if something broke inside. It was after this meeting with the authorities that Symonenko started having kidney problems, which led to his death at the age of 29. Of course, no one sought out the zealous guards of order.
With the poet's death, the national consciousness of many contemporaries was awakened. Paradoxically, Symonenko's death gave birth to faith in the future of Ukraine, says Yevhen Sverstyuk. During the funeral, his diaries and archive fell into the hands of the poet's friends. Among the items was almost the only recording of Symonenko's poems, in his own voice, made by Ivan Svitlana during the poet's last visit to Kyiv. Subsequently, Petro Zasenko went to Symonenko's mother and transcribed unpublished poems, which he included in a collection of selected poems from 1967 that was never published. After that, Symonenko's works were not published in Ukraine for 15 years. Other poets and poetesses immediately after his death were visited by literary experts in Apolets, who scrutinized their manuscripts and removed anything deemed dubious. In 1965, the magazine Suchasnist in Munich published Symonenko's poems together with fragments of his diary titled Pieces of Thoughts, and his collection Shore of Waiting. This small book had the effect of a bomb. Symonenko was copied, quoted, talked about on the radio, and written about in the press. We were so impressed by the power of his poems that we named the publishing house Smolensko after Vasyl Symonenko. We had no idea that such creativity was possible in Ukraine, recalls Osip Zinkevich, the director of the publishing house. In 1965, Symonenko was nominated for the Shevchenko Prize. However, it was not meant to be. The poet received it only 30 years later in independent Ukraine.
Where are you now, tortures of my nation? Where is your grandeur? Where is your power? Your black malevolence will not fall onto bright stars and quiet waters. The nation grows and proliferates and acts without your whips and swords. Its cruel and tender soul grows ancient and young beneath the sun of eternity. My nation is, my nation always will be. No one will efface my nation. All the werewolves and intruders will disappear, along with the hordes of conqueror vagabonds. You, bastards of the rabid torturers, don't forget, you monsters, anywhere. My nation is. Cossack blood is pulsing and humming in its oxen veins.